Imagine being accused of a crime you didn't commit. Imagine standing in a courtroom where everyone, the judge, the jury, the prosecutor, has already decided you're guilty before you even open your mouth. That's exactly what happened to Xavier Reed. This is not just a story, it's a reality for thousands of innocent people. But Xavier did something unthinkable. He took on the system that was built to destroy him. And what happened next? No one saw it coming. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. And if you love powerful stories, subscribe to Inspiring Stories Told. The rain came down in sheets, thick and unrelenting, drenching the cracked pavement of New Orleans' 7th Ward. Sirens howled through the night, their eerie red and blue lights cutting through the storm like razor blades. Xavier Reed barely had time to register the flashing lights before he was yanked backward, his hood ripped from his head. Get on the ground. A pair of hands, rough, violent, gripped his collar and slammed him face first against the slick hood of a police cruiser. His skull rattled, his vision blurred, but before he could protest, a knee dug into his spine, crushing the air from his lungs. "I didn't do anything," he gasped, his voice barely cutting through the sound of rain slapping the metal of the car. "You shut your damn mouth," a voice sneered into his ear, thick with contempt. "Officer Brad Matthews." Xavier gritted his teeth as cold metal cuffs clamped around his wrists, biting into his skin. His body was shaking not from the cold, but from the raw, undiluted terror ripping through him. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. He had just left the library at Xavier University, heading home after a long night of studying for his constitutional law exam. He was going to be a lawyer. That was the plan. Not this. Not another statistic. The reality hit him as Officer Matthews yanked him upright, his fingers curling around the back of Xavier's neck like he was handling an animal. "Got you now, boy," Matthews muttered under his breath. Xavier barely had time to register the racial slur before he was shoved into the back seat of the cruiser, his head knocking against the frame of the door. Pain bloomed across his temple, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of hearing him cry out. The heavy door slammed shut, locking him in. He could hear them outside, Matthews and the other officers, laughing, congratulating each other. "Another one off the streets," one of them muttered. "Yeah, punk thought he could run," Matthews added. Xavier's stomach churned. He hadn't run. He hadn't done anything. But none of that mattered. Through the rain-blurred window, he saw the black Audi parked at the gas station across the street. The car he was apparently accused of stealing. The crime he hadn't committed. How the hell was this happening? An hour passed before they dragged him out of the cruiser and hauled him into the precinct. The station smelled like sweat, stale coffee, and something rotten lingering in the air. They didn't let him call his mother. Didn't let him call a lawyer. Didn't tell him anything except, "You're going down for this, kid." They threw him into an interrogation room. No windows, just a flickering fluorescent light that buzzed like an insect in the silence. The metal chair beneath him was cold, the cuffs digging into his skin as his hands remained shackled behind him. The door swung open, and in walked Matthews, still dripping from the rain. His uniform clung to his thick frame, his belt heavy with the weight of his gun and badge. He looked at Xavier like he was something less than human. "You know, I don't like liars," Matthews said casually, rolling up his sleeves. "But I really don't like thieves." Xavier's jaw clenched. "I didn't steal anything." Matthews chuckled, shaking his head like he'd heard it all before. "You kids always say that." His knuckles cracked. Xavier's heartbeat pounded in his ears. Then came the first punch. A white-hot explosion of pain as Matthews' fist connected with Xavier's ribs. Then another. Xavier gasped, struggling to breathe, but the pain was suffocating. "Come on, tough guy. You had plenty to say outside," Matthews mocked, grabbing a fistful of Xavier's damp hoodie and yanking him forward. "Where's that smart mouth now?" Xavier coughed, his vision swimming. "I didn't steal anything." Matthews sighed like he was disappointed. "Shame. We could have made this easy." He let Xavier go, and he collapsed forward, his forehead hitting the table. "Don't worry," Matthews said, heading for the door. "We'll make sure the DA nails you to the wall." But if you confess now, maybe you'll get a lighter sentence." He left the room. Xavier sat there, his breath ragged, his body screaming in pain. He wasn't getting out of this. Not unless he fought back. By the time his public defender arrived, the weight of the accusations had fully settled on his shoulders. Grand theft auto. Resisting arrest. They were saying they had his fingerprints on the steering wheel. That a witness saw him running from the gas station where the car was stolen. It was all a lie. They had planted his prints. The witness statement was fake. And the so-called chase? Xavier hadn't even run. None of it mattered. His public defender, a woman named Melissa Kane, barely glanced at him when she walked in. She dropped a thick file onto the table and sighed. "Look, Xavier," she said, rubbing her temples. "This is bad. The DA is looking for a quick conviction." Xavier blinked at her. "I didn't steal anything." She nodded absently, flipping through her papers. "Sure, but they have evidence. And a witness." Xavier's stomach twisted. "The witness is lying." She exhaled sharply, finally looking at him. "Then why were you arrested?" Xavier stared at her, his breath caught in his throat. She didn't believe him. It was already over. That night, they threw Xavier into a freezing cell, the concrete floor harder than anything he'd ever felt. The thin cot offered no warmth, and the food was barely edible. He was left alone for hours. No water, no blanket, nothing but the sound of a leaking pipe somewhere in the corner. By morning, his face was on the news. A grainy mugshot. His name. The words "Grand Theft Auto Suspect in Custody" plastered across the screen. The media painted him as guilty before the trial even began. The reporters didn't say he was a student. They didn't say he had no record. All they saw was a young black man, a criminal in their eyes. The next day, the cops tried to make him sign a confession. "Sign this," Matthews demanded, shoving the paper in front of him. Xavier swallowed, his throat raw from dehydration. His fingers trembled as he looked at the words. "I'm innocent," he whispered. Matthews slammed his fist on the table. "You sign that, or we make sure you get 20 years. You hear me?" Xavier's pulse pounded. The pen felt heavy in his hands. 20 years. He thought of his mother, of his future, of the life he had planned. His hand hovered over the page. Then he dropped the pen. "No," he said, his voice stronger than he expected. Matthew's eyes darkened. "You're making a mistake, boy." But Xavier wasn't backing down. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And when the trial came, he would be ready. The air inside the Orleans Parish Courthouse was thick, almost suffocating. Every seat in the gallery was filled, spectators whispering among themselves, the weight of expectation pressing down on Xavier's chest. He could feel their stares like knives against his skin. Most of the jury was white. A few middle-aged men in suits, a woman in pearls, a couple of retirees who looked like they had never set foot in his neighborhood before. Some of them refused to look at him, their gazes fixed on the polished wood of the jury box. Others had already made up their minds. He could see it in their eyes. He was guilty before the trial even started. Xavier sat stiffly at the defense table, his hands clenched beneath the polished oak surface. Across the room, Prosecutor Jonathan Carlyle adjusted his tie, then slowly rose to his feet, his expression cool, calculated. This was just another day for him. Another conviction to add to his record. He stepped toward the jury with the air of a man who already knew he'd won. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a dangerous criminal," he began, his voice smooth, confident. "A man who didn't hesitate to steal, to flee, to break the law without a second thought. A man who ran from the police because he knew exactly what he had done." Xavier's stomach twisted. Carlyle turned slightly, his eyes scanning the faces of the jurors, lowering his voice to something almost conspiratorial. "This is not about race. This is about law and order. A lie. A blatant lie. Xavier knew it. His mother knew it. Everyone who had lived through this system knew it. But it was a carefully crafted lie, one meant to make the jurors feel comfortable, to ease their guilt. The prosecutor took a slow, deliberate step forward. This isn't some misunderstanding. The defendant was caught red-handed. His fingerprints were found on the stolen vehicle. He had no reasonable explanation. And when the police attempted to approach him, he ran. He let the words settle in the air, then turned toward the jury, his expression grave. Now, I ask you, what kind of innocent man runs from the law? Xavier's hands curled into fists beneath the table. Carlyle didn't stop there. He painted a picture of Xavier as a menace, a thug, someone who belonged behind bars. He never outright said it, but the implication was there in every word. You've all seen the news. You know what's happening in this city. Crime is out of control. There it was. The unspoken fear, the quiet bias he was tapping into. He was priming them, feeding their worst assumptions. Xavier wasn't a student anymore. He wasn't an honor roll kid with aspirations of law school. He was just another faceless statistic to them now. Carlyle finally stepped back, letting out a satisfied breath. The evidence will speak for itself, he said smoothly. And when it does, I trust that you, the jury, will do what's right. He returned to his seat, his smirk barely concealed. Across the room, Judge Harold Sinclair leaned back in his chair, looking bored, his fingers drumming lazily against the bench. He looked at Xavier the same way he might look at a stain on his expensive robes, an inconvenience, something he had no interest in dealing with for longer than necessary. Xavier's mouth felt dry. Judge Sinclair turned toward the defense table. Miss Kane, your opening statement? Melissa Kane, Xavier's public defender, jerked upright in her seat as if she had forgotten she was supposed to speak. She cleared her throat, adjusting her glasses. Yes, Your Honor. Her voice wavered. Xavier closed his eyes. This was a disaster. Kane fumbled with her notes. The prosecution has made some very strong accusations, but I just asked the jury to keep an open mind as we review the evidence. That was it. No passion. No defense. Just a weak, timid request for fairness in a courtroom that had already decided there would be none. Carlyle smirked. The judge looked unimpressed. The jury looked disinterested. Xavier felt like the floor had just been ripped out from under him. Officer Matthews took the stand first, his uniform crisp, his posture straight, his voice steady. He was lying. Xavier knew it. He listened as Matthews described the events of that night like they were scripted. We found the suspect in close proximity to the stolen vehicle, Matthews said, his tone full of practiced authority. He attempted to flee on foot before being apprehended. His fingerprints were lifted from the steering wheel. The evidence is undeniable. Carlyle nodded along, feeding the jury every piece of information like it was gospel. Officer Matthews, would you say the arrest was by the book? Absolutely, sir. A well-rehearsed performance. Carlyle turned to the jury, nodding. No further questions. When it was Kane's turn to cross-examine, Xavier prayed she would ask the right questions, poke holes in Matthews' report, challenge his inconsistencies. But she didn't. She barely questioned him at all. Officer, you're confident in your report? Yes, ma'am. No further questions. Xavier's breath hitched. She wasn't even trying. Judge Sinclair didn't even pretend to be impartial. When Xavier noticed inconsistencies in Matthews' report and tried to whisper them to Kane, the judge shot him a glare. Control your client, Miss Kane. Xavier gritted his teeth. And then came the worst moment of all. Carlyle pulled out a mugshot. It wasn't Xavier's. It was another black man, someone completely unrelated to the case. But Carlyle flashed it before the jury for just a moment too long. Just enough for the subliminal message to sink in. Xavier's blood ran cold. There was one person who could save him. Elijah King. His best friend. Elijah knew Xavier was innocent. He had been there that night. He had seen everything. But when it was time for him to testify, he didn't show up. Xavier's stomach twisted. He wasn't coming. Fear had gotten to him. The threats. The pressure. Xavier was truly alone. Carlyle stepped forward again, delivering the final nail in the coffin. Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence, I'd like to request that we expedite the proceedings. There's no need for excessive deliberation. Judge Sinclair nodded. I agree. And just like that, Xavier's fate was nearly sealed. He looked out into the crowd, his gaze locking onto his mother. Kendra Reed sat frozen, her hands clasped together, silent tears streaking down her face. Xavier swallowed past the lump in his throat. The system was a machine. Cold, ruthless, built to destroy him. But if they thought he would go down without a fight, they had no idea who they were dealing with. How does this make you feel? Do you feel the anger boiling inside you as Xavier sits there, watching his fate being decided before he even speaks? Do you feel the helplessness, the frustration, the sheer injustice of it all? Imagine being in his shoes, knowing the truth, knowing you're innocent, but no one cares. What would you do if the system had already made up its mind about you? Would you fight back, even when the odds are impossible? Or would you break under the weight of it all? Because now, Xavier has one choice left, and it will change everything. The weight of injustice crushed Xavier's chest like a lead brick. Every second that passed, every word from his so-called defense attorney, every smug glance from prosecutor Carlisle, pushed him closer to the edge. This was not a trial. This was a script. A carefully rehearsed performance where the ending had already been written. Judge Sinclair had barely concealed his impatience. Kane, his so-called defender, had all but given up. And the jury, a jury that had barely looked at him like a human being, was nodding along, drinking in every poison word from Carlisle's mouth. Something inside Xavier snapped. He couldn't let this happen. His hands, still shaking with frustration, pressed against the table as he stood up. His voice, steady, clear, sharper than steel, cut through the courtroom like a blade. Your Honor, I'm firing my attorney. I will represent myself. A stunned silence descended upon the room. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the soft, distant ticking of the courtroom clock. Then a wave of gasps. A ripple of whispers. Someone in the gallery muttered, "Oh, this kid is crazy." Kane's head jerked toward him, her mouth falling open in shock. Xavier, no, Judge Sinclair leaned forward, his eyebrows raised in amusement. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. You? He scoffed, shaking his head. You think you can defend yourself, son? Carlisle smirked, leaning back in his chair, crossing his arms. Well, this should be entertaining. The jury exchanged uncertain glances. And that's when Xavier realized something. The first crack in their carefully built case had just formed. They thought they had complete control, but they hadn't expected this. And now he had their attention. Judge Sinclair sighed, rubbing his temple. Fine. If the defendant wants to waste his time, so be it. But you better be ready, boy, because we're not slowing down for you. Xavier nodded. I understand, Your Honor. He turned to face the jury, his expression calm, composed. But inside, his heart pounded like a war drum. He had never done this before, but he had spent years studying court trials, analyzing strategies, memorizing tactics. He had been preparing for this his whole life, even if he never knew it. It was time to fight. Carlisle stood, grinning like he had already won. The state calls Officer Brad Matthews to the stand. Matthews strode up like a man completely confident in his own lies. He took his oath, sat down, adjusted his badge like it was some holy relic. Carlisle wasted no time. Officer Matthews, please recount the events of the arrest. And he did, word for word, the exact same flawless, practiced lie he had given before. When Carlisle finished, he turned toward Xavier with a condescending smirk. Your witness, he said mockingly. Xavier stood slowly, stepping toward the witness stand. His palms were sweaty, his throat dry, but he forced himself to focus. His voice was even, controlled, dangerous. Officer Matthews, I'd like to confirm something. You stated, under oath, that you personally witnessed me inside the stolen vehicle before making the arrest. Is that correct? Matthews rolled his shoulders, bored. That's right. Xavier tilted his head. And your report says you were on duty at the time of the arrest? Yes. A pause. A deliberate, heavy pause. Then, Xavier took a slow step forward, his voice dropping lower. So if I were to request your GPS logs from that night, they would match your statement? A flicker. A barely noticeable shift in Matthew's expression. But Xavier saw it. And so did the jury. Carlisle leaned forward slightly, his smirk faltering. Objection, Carlisle snapped. This is a waste of time. Judge Sinclair rubbed his temple, exasperated. What exactly are you trying to prove, kid? Xavier turned, facing the entire courtroom. I'm proving that Officer Matthews wasn't where he claimed to be that night. A hushed wave of murmurs rolled through the gallery. Carlyle's jaw clenched. The officer's report is official. It stands on its own. Xavier smirked. Then you shouldn't mind confirming it with GPS records, right? The silence was deafening. Carlyle's eyes darkened. Judge Sinclair scowled. Move on. There it was. They were blocking him. That night, back in his cell, Xavier's ribs ached from the previous beating. His head throbbed from the stress of the trial. But he had made a dent, and the system knew it. He didn't sleep that night. Because at 2 a.m., his cell door clanged open. 2 guards stepped inside. Get up, one of them ordered. Xavier sat up slowly, his heart hammering. What's going on? The guard's cold smirk sent ice through his veins. Warden wants to see you. They dragged him down the halls, but not toward the warden's office. Toward a dimly lit storage room. The second the door shut, one of the guards slammed him against the wall. You think you're smart, huh? Xavier gritted his teeth, forcing himself not to react. You don't make the rules, Reed. You're nothing. You hear me? A punch to the ribs. Pain shot through his body, but he stayed standing. You're gonna walk into that courtroom tomorrow, the guard sneered, and you're gonna lose, understand? A final shove, and they walked away, leaving him in the darkness. Xavier's chest rose and fell heavily. But he wasn't backing down. If they thought they could scare him into submission, they were dead wrong. The next morning, Xavier limped into the courtroom. Judge Sinclair barely looked at him. But Carlyle? Carlyle was grinning. He had something. The prosecutor stood, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, I'd like to submit additional evidence regarding the defendant's past criminal history. Xavier's stomach dropped. No. I have here records of the defendant's juvenile offenses, Carlyle continued smoothly. At age 14, he was caught trespassing on private property. Age 16, a minor altercation at school. The jury shifted, some of them frowning. Carlyle was twisting the narrative. He wanted them to believe Xavier was a career criminal. Judge Sinclair waved a lazy hand. I'll allow it. Xavier's fingers dug into the table. He should have known. They weren't going to play fair. But this wasn't over. He could still fight. And he would. Because now, he wasn't just defending himself. He was exposing the truth. And the system was running out of places to hide. Xavier sat at the defense table, his hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every muscle in his body was tense, his mind racing through every possibility, every counterattack. He had taken blow after blow, beaten in jail, denied evidence, sabotaged at every turn. He had been painted as a criminal, a lost cause, a menace to society. But now, the cracks in their story were starting to show. And it was time to tear the whole damn case apart. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as the next witness took the stand. Xavier's heart nearly stopped. Elijah King. His best friend. The one person who could destroy the prosecution's lies. Xavier's breath caught in his throat as Elijah adjusted the microphone, looking visibly shaken. The judge squinted. State your name for the record. Elijah swallowed hard. Elijah King. Carlyle's chair creaked loudly as he leaned forward, his smirk faltering for the first time. He hadn't expected this. Neither had Judge Sinclair. For the first time since the trial began, the judge looked uncomfortable. Proceed, Sinclair muttered. Xavier leaned forward, every nerve in his body on edge. Kane had refused to call Elijah earlier. Said he was too unreliable. Said it wasn't worth the risk. But Elijah was here now, and he looked like he was about to say something that would change everything. Xavier inhaled sharply. Don't be afraid, man. Tell them the truth. Carlyle stood, smoothing his tie, feigning confidence. Mr. King, you were close to the defendant, were you not? Elijah nodded. Yeah, Xavier's my best friend. Carlyle turned to the jury, shrugging. So I assume you'll say anything to protect him? Elijah's eyes darkened. No, sir. I'm here to tell the truth. Carlyle smirked. Very well. Where were you on the night of the alleged grand theft auto? Elijah straightened in his seat. With Xavier. We were together at the campus library studying for an exam. We left together and walked home. He never went near that car. Silence. A ripple of murmurs spread through the jury box. Xavier's pulse pounded. This was it. This was what he needed. Carlisle forced a smile, but Xavier saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. Interesting, Carlisle said, his voice tightening. But surely you understand that your word alone doesn't disprove the evidence against Mr. Reed. Elijah clenched his fists. I didn't come here just to talk. I have proof. The courtroom erupted. Carlisle's smirk evaporated. The judge stiffened in his chair. What proof? Sinclair snapped. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I have our GPS data. Our phones tracked us at the library that night. Xavier's phone never left the area until we both walked home. Carlisle paled. Xavier felt his heart nearly burst out of his chest. They had him. Carlisle scrambled. Your Honor, we cannot verify this data without proper forensic examination. The door suddenly opened. A man in a suit walked in, his presence sending another shockwave through the courtroom. Detective Paul Moreno. Internal Affairs. Carlisle's face drained of color. This was spiraling out of his control. Moreno stepped forward, holding a folder. Your Honor, I have official GPS records subpoenaed from the police department system. It shows Officer Matthews was never at the scene when he claimed to witness the defendant in the stolen vehicle. Chaos. Absolute chaos. Judge Sinclair slammed his gavel, but his usual arrogance was gone. His forehead was damp with sweat. Carlisle looked like a caged animal, scrambling for a lifeline. This is absurd, he barked. These records could be inaccurate. We can't trust GPS data over an officer's sworn testimony. Moreno cut him off, his voice cold and firm. Are you suggesting Officer Matthews' sworn testimony is worth more than verifiable location tracking data? Carlisle opened his mouth, then closed it. Xavier sat back, watching it all unfold. They were losing. For the first time, the jury wasn't just nodding along with the prosecution. They were thinking, questioning, doubting. And doubt? Doubt was all Xavier needed. Carlisle was breathing hard, his eyes darting toward Judge Sinclair. Then, suddenly, he smirked. He wasn't done yet. Your Honor, before we proceed, I have newly discovered evidence. Xavier's stomach dropped. What? Judge Sinclair perked up, as if waiting for Carlisle to throw him a lifeline. Carlisle pulled out a grainy, black and white security photo. A figure, put up, face shadowed, standing near the stolen car. It appears the defendant was seen closer to the scene than he initially claimed, Carlisle announced. Gasps. Whispers. Xavier's hands shook. This was a setup. A last-ditch, desperate play. Xavier stood slowly, facing Carlisle head-on. No fear. No hesitation. Your Honor, that's an incredibly convenient piece of evidence to suddenly appear. Carlisle flashed a grin. Sometimes, additional evidence comes to light late in a case. Xavier turned to the jury. And sometimes, when the case is falling apart, evidence gets planted. A sharp intake of breath from the gallery. Carlisle's smile faltered. Objection, he snapped. Judge Sinclair banged his gavel. Sustained. Mr. Reed, tread carefully. Xavier didn't stop. That image is worthless, he said coldly. There's no clear identification, no timestamp, no way to verify when it was taken. It's a distraction. He turned to the jury, looking each of them in the eye. You've heard the lies. You've seen the evidence falling apart, piece by piece. You know the truth. He let his words settle, let the weight of it sink into their bones. Now ask yourself, what else have they lied about? Judge Sinclair looked visibly agitated. The jury wasn't nodding along with the prosecution anymore. They weren't eating up the narrative. Carlisle knew it too. His confidence was gone. This case was no longer in his hands. Judge Sinclair sighed heavily. Court is adjourned for today. The jury will reconvene tomorrow for deliberation. But Xavier saw it in his eyes. He knew this case was slipping through his fingers. He just wasn't ready to admit it yet. Xavier exhaled slowly, turning to his mother in the gallery. Tears lined her eyes. But for the first time since this nightmare began, She looked like she finally had hope. The courtroom was dead silent. The jurors sat in their box, their faces tense, their hands gripping the wooden armrests of their chairs. Some of them refused to look in Xavier's direction, while others wore expressions of guilt, uncertainty, or quiet revelation. Xavier's chest tightened. His hands were clammy against the cool wood of the defense table. This was it. After everything, the lies, the beatings, the threats, the humiliations, it all came down to this moment. He felt his mother's presence behind him in the gallery. Kendra Reed was barely breathing, clutching the cross around her neck like it was the only thing holding her together. Judge Sinclair sat at his bench, his face unreadable, but Xavier could see the tension in his jaw. This wasn't going the way he had wanted. He had done everything to keep the system running as usual, to push Xavier into the gears and crush him like so many before him. But Xavier had fought back. Now, the verdict was no longer in the judge's hands. It was in the hands of 12 people who had watched the case unravel piece by piece. The jury foreman, a balding man in his 60s, rose slowly, gripping a small folded paper in his hand. His expression was neutral, but Xavier could see the way his fingers trembled slightly. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Sinclair asked, his voice clipped, like he was already bracing for an outcome he didn't want. The foreman cleared his throat. "We have, Your Honor." Xavier swallowed, his pulse hammering. Everything slowed down. The sound of Kendra softly whispering a prayer behind him, the weight of every stare in the room, the way Carlyle sat with his hands clasped, eyes cold and narrow. The foreman unfolded the slip of paper. He took a breath. Then, in a loud, clear voice, he read the words that would change Xavier's life forever. "On the charge of grand theft auto, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." For a moment, Xavier didn't move, didn't breathe. The room exploded. Gasps, murmurs, the sharp, chaotic scraping of chairs as people turned to one another, stunned. Kendra let out a wail of relief, covering her face with both hands. The reporters in the back began furiously scribbling notes, some whispering into microphones, trying to capture the moment live. But Xavier? He just stared. The words rattled in his skull, bouncing off every cell of his being. Not guilty. Not guilty. Not guilty. Judge Sinclair's face darkened. He gritted his teeth, nodding stiffly. The defendant is acquitted of all charges. Case dismissed. But he didn't slam the gavel down. Not right away. Because this wasn't just a case dismissal. This was a defeat. For him. For the system he upheld. For the first time in his career, his power had been challenged and beaten in his own courtroom. Xavier slowly turned toward the prosecution's table. Carlyle sat frozen, his lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. He had lost. For the first time, his confidence was gone. Because if this case had fallen apart so easily, how many others had he built on lies? Just when Xavier thought it was over, Detective Paul Moreno stood from the gallery. "Your Honor, if I may," he called out. Sinclair's eyes flickered with irritation, but he nodded. Moreno held up a folder. "Following the revelations in this case, the Internal Affairs Division has opened an official investigation into Officer Brad Matthews. Based on new evidence, we are placing him under arrest for perjury, falsifying police reports, and obstruction of justice." Another shockwave rolled through the room. A murmur of disbelief. A few gasps. Carlyle shot up from his seat. "That's ridiculous. This is highly irregular." But he was cut off by the sound of approaching footsteps. 2 uniformed officers entered the courtroom. And then, in front of everyone, Officer Matthews, who had once shoved Xavier to the ground like he was nothing, was led away in handcuffs. His face burned red. His jaw clenched. But he didn't fight it. He knew it was over. The last thing Xavier heard before Matthews disappeared through the doors was the faint, bitter mutter under his breath. "Damn kid should have just taken the plea." As soon as Xavier stepped outside, the bright sun hit his face, but it didn't feel warm. It felt unfamiliar, like he had been trapped in darkness for so long that the light didn't feel real anymore. His mother was there. She didn't say a word. She just threw her arms around him, held him so tight that he thought he might break, and sobbed into his shoulder. Xavier closed his eyes and let himself feel it. The relief, the exhaustion, the weight of everything that had happened. But even as the moment stretched, he knew something deep inside him had changed. He would never be the same. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about every person who never got the chance to fight. Every name that had been buried under false convictions. Every black man thrown into a system designed to crush them before they even had a chance. He had made it out. But how many others didn't? The reporters surrounded him, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in his face. Xavier, what are you going to do next? How does it feel to have beaten the system? Do you have anything to say to the people who doubted you? Xavier took a deep breath. He looked straight into the cameras, his voice steady, his words clear. I'm going to law school. Gasps. Murmurs. The reporters blinked, stunned. But Xavier wasn't finished. Because I refuse to let this happen to anyone else. How many other innocent men have been convicted just like Xavier? How many never got the chance to prove their innocence? How many are still behind bars, their voices unheard, their stories untold? Xavier fought back. But what about the ones who couldn't? One day, it might not be him. It might be someone you know. Share this story. Keep talking about it. Because the fight isn't over. Xavier Reed may have walked out of that courthouse a free man. But the truth is, he was never truly free to begin with. Not when he had to fight tooth and nail against a system designed to bury him. Not when his innocence meant nothing against a prosecutor's ambition, a judge's bias, or a police officer's lies. He had to prove his own worth in a courtroom that never saw him as human in the first place. And here's the terrifying part. How many others never got the chance? How many innocent black men have sat where Xavier sat? Handcuffed, beaten, humiliated, their names dragged through the mud before they even spoke a word in their defense? How many have been thrown into prison cells, their stories untold, their lives stolen, not because they were guilty, but because the world expected them to be? Xavier's victory shouldn't have been a miracle. It should have been a guarantee. And yet, we all know the truth. He was one of the lucky ones. But luck shouldn't determine justice. That's why this story matters. That's why you can't just walk away from this and forget it. Because one day, it might not be Xavier. It might be your brother, your friend, your neighbor, you. So what are you going to do about it? The system wins when people stay silent. It wins when people look away, when they pretend these injustices don't happen, when they think it's someone else's problem. But this is everyone's problem. What happened to Xavier is not just a story. It's a reality for thousands of innocent people across the country. And that reality only changes when people start paying attention. So don't let this be the end. If you felt the anger, the frustration, the helplessness while watching Xavier fight against a machine that tried to crush him, use that emotion. Don't let it fade the moment the video ends. Turn that rage into action. Speak up when you see injustice. Support organizations that fight for real criminal justice reform. Educate yourself and others about wrongful convictions and racial bias in the system. Never stop questioning authority when power is being abused. And most importantly, stay engaged. Like this video if you stand with Xavier. Because his fight isn't just his fight. It's the fight of every single person who has ever been silenced by a system that doesn't see them as human. It's the fight of the innocent man sitting in a cell right now, hoping someone out there still believes in justice. So let's make sure his hope isn't in vain. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this isn't the last story we're telling. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.